Hey everyone, welcome back to our second session. Before we get into today's topic, I'd like to go ahead and give a brief introduction to the sort of things that we're going to be talking about. I mentioned last time this concept of the sons of God. Now, you've probably heard that concept before, but I mentioned it in reference to Job, this idea of sons of God presenting themselves before Yahweh. And we encountered this a little bit in the book of Job. Specifically, it's in Job chapter 1 and chapter 2. And you're probably very familiar with this idea of being a son of God from the New Testament. So there's a place in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, I think it's verse 12 if I recall correctly, where it says, "To those who believed in Jesus, to those God gave the right or the authority to become sons of God." Now that's an interesting phrase because the idea of son of God being a position of authority is really one that captures what the Old Testament does with the concept itself. So, for example, in the Old Testament, the idea of being a, quote, son of God was a position of authority. It was a way to describe a royal or authoritative function within the family of God. And that's what makes this concept so important for our study, because in the book of Job, specifically again in chapter 1 and chapter 2, you get this scene where the sons of God are presenting themselves before Yahweh as if to give a report to Yahweh. And this is something that we have to wrestle with. So what I want to do just for a few minutes as we get into today's topic, today's lesson, I want to just explore this concept just a little bit further, because I mentioned it last time, but I want to dig a little bit deeper as it'll set the stage for our longer discussions elsewhere. So let's look at this idea of sons of God. The phrase appears in very key parts of the Old Testament. So as you can see from the slide, there are several passages that this phrase occurs in that we want to dive into. We've got Genesis, we've got Deuteronomy 32, of course Job, and also Psalm 82. So Job 38, verses 4 through 7 says, quote, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." Now let me stop here. The context of this is whenever God is speaking to Job and he's recalling the creation account, that when the foundations of the earth were made. So where were you, Job, when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Now, that last part here is what I want to focus on. When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Now, what's up with the star language, the morning star language? Well, in the Old Testament and in the ancient world, the cosmological language of like stars or shining things in the heavens were often depicted, or were often used to depict heavenly beings. So throughout Scripture, even in the New Testament, you'll see star language used to describe a spiritual being, such as an angel, okay? So here in Job 38, verse 7, God speaks about the, quote, morning stars, the stars singing together. Why were they singing? Well, here in this text, they're singing because God has created the cosmos, and they're rejoicing over that. And here, what's interesting about Job 38, verse 7, is that it actually tells us who the stars are. It says that they're the sons of God when they were shouting for joy. So there's our phrase, sons of God. These are heavenly beings who were apparently present when God created the cosmos, and they were singing and praising him as he was doing so. Now, again, in the ancient world, this idea of God having sons who were sort of like spiritual beings that were in attendance around him, that idea is very prevalent in ancient religion, in the ancient Near Eastern world. So in the ancient world, you would have the God, the main God, and he would have subjects under him. Sort of a divine council is the language that's used. He's got a kingly court. that are sort of his underlords or something. Now, what's interesting is when you read the Bible, the Old Testament in particular, you get this same idea. Yahweh is the one creator God. He's unique. No one's like him. He created everything. But underneath him, he has lords, if you will. He's got a divine council. And we'll actually see that word divine council in the text in a moment. But let's look at Genesis 6. You see the phrase sons of God here. In Genesis 6, 1 and 2, we get a glimpse at how at least some of the sons of God, some of those under lords, under Yahweh, some of them have rebelled. So, for example, Genesis 6, 1 to 2, when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. Now, the story goes that they go down and they have relations with these human ladies and they have offspring. And that's depicted in Genesis as a very bad thing. It's an act of rebellion against Yahweh and against what he willed for them. Okay, now, so at least here we have a rebellion, a description of a rebellion among the sons of God. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them rebelled against God and God's order. You also have this text in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. This is a text that describes how Yahweh has chosen Israel out of all the nations of the world. He has chosen Israel for his own people, but the rest of the nations of the world, he's delivered up to the sons of God. Listen to this, Deuteronomy 32, verse 8 and 9. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. You'll have to go back and get the whole context of that, but this is the relevant part I want us to focus on, that he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Now, what that means is that each of the nations, the people living within certain borders, they were each given to the sons of God. And the idea, I think, here is that the sons of God were given stewardship over the nations to lead them in righteousness. But God would have his own program of sorts with Israel. He had his own purposes for Israel, namely, if you know the Genesis story, he calls Israel to be a blessing to all the nations of the world. He wants to redeem all the nations through Israel. But in the meantime, he's going to divide up the nations among the divine council, these sons of God, these heavenly beings, the assumption being that they would lead them rightly. But things go wrong in this story. When we look, for example, at a very important psalm, Psalm 82, we see that God is upset with these, at least some of the sons of God. Okay, so notice Psalm 82 at the very beginning, verse 1. Psalm 82, verse 1 says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. We'll get to more of that in a bit, but let me just comment on this. Here we have this idea of a divine council. This is a good translation of the text of the Hebrew, that God has taken his place, Yahweh has taken his place among the divine council, these underlords, these heavenly beings that God has given them something to do, but he's upset with them for some reason, and we'll see why in a moment. But he's upset with them for some reason, and he's holding judgment among the gods. Now here, they're just called gods with a little g, G-O-D-S. They're gods nonetheless, so I like to ask people, does the Bible teach there are many gods? It depends what you mean by that. There's only one creator God, and his name is Yahweh. There's only one God who is worthy of our worship and devotion. That is Yahweh. And he created everything. He created you, me, the world. He created the sons of God. He created heavenly beings, earthly beings, whatever. He did it all. He's the one true God. But there are heavenly beings underneath him that he created, who, at least in the Bible, Psalm 82, I didn't write the Bible, I didn't make this up. Go read it for yourself in Psalm 82, verse 1. These heavenly beings are called little g, O-D-S, gods. It's interesting. They're not worthy of worship. It's against the rules to worship them because they're not your creator. But nonetheless, they are called divine beings, and they have rebelled against God. They've done something against what God wanted them to do. And as we'll see, they've actually led the nations astray. And this, according to some scholars, is why what the Hebrews thought that was the reason for why the nations went astray and worshipped idols, is because the gods led them astray. They were supposed to lead them into righteousness. Instead, they led them into unrighteousness. And now Yahweh is upset, and he's sitting among his council, and he's about to hold judgment among them. So with that in the back of our mind, we have this category of Son of God, and there's heavenly beings who are out there doing really bad things. So when we talk about the problem of evil, we have to remember one thing, that evil happens when earthly beings like you and me do really bad things, but that's not the full story. According to Scripture, if we want an accurate account of what the problem of evil is all about, then we can't only talk about earthly beings doing earthly bad things, but we also have to understand that there are spiritual beings doing very bad things behind the veil, so to speak. We've got to take that into account if we want to understand what the problem of evil is all about. Now, since we've got that in place and we understand what's going on, let's go ahead and jump in today's lesson.
So God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And he says to them, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. In other words, he's accusing the gods of doing all sorts of dastardly things, unjust, unruly, evil, wicked things. And he says to them, I can't really see that, sorry. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. And he says, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. And he says, arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. So what's going on here? Well, God is very angry because apparently the gods that he put in oversight over these nations, they have led the nations astray. They've led them in unrighteousness. This is that third divine rebellion that we've talked about. This is the third instance of a divine rebellion in Scripture. These gods, these spiritual beings, I guess apparently looked out on the nations and they thought, I'd like to have them worship me, right? And we don't know how many were involved in this plot, but God says, I'm going to judge you and you're going to die like men. And the assumption is they're not men, they're angels, but they're going to suffer the same fate as people. They're going to die. And they're going to be judged and cast away. And then the end is like the narrator, the psalmist says, arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. Meaning God's going to take all the nations back because they've been led astray. And this is why Jesus will say in Matthew 28, the Great Commission, all authority has been given to me, therefore go baptize to go to all nations, baptizing them, teaching all things that I've commanded you. We're going to take back the ground that the gods have taken, right, and misused. So that's sort of the idea. I can't emphasize this enough. When it comes to the world around us, it's a lot more crowded than we were led to believe. I think that's the idea. There's an invisible reality that is teeming with life, right? And that's what's going on. And these are not angels. The word angel, by the way, comes from angelos, the Greek word angelos, and it just simply means messenger. Sometimes people are called messengers. The word angel is more or less like a job description, as somebody said once. It's a job description. It's not like an identity of what a being is. It's just what they do, more or less, right? So these spiritual beings are actually the result of a lot of wickedness and evil. According to the Psalm, it's the wickedness and evil in the world is due to what they're doing behind the scenes. So already we're starting to get a feel of what's going on in the problem of evil. Okay, so you've got that in the back of your mind. By the time we come to Job, we see the relevance of all of this. So this is where we're still rehashing. And by the way, I don't have my phone. I don't know, Taj, it's right over there. Do you mind I just don't want to keep you more than 4 hours tonight. So, yeah, thanks. Okay. So I'm going to just go read through this text. We're going to walk through it, and we're going to get to some good stuff here. It says, now there was a day when the sons of God See how that phrase all of a sudden has totally different meaning now, right? Thank you. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Now the idea here is that they are coming to give a report to the Lord, like answer for what they've done. Not that they've done anything wrong, but they're just come to say, hey, here's what I've been doing, here's what I've been leading people, here's what I've been doing on earth. I'm reporting back to the commander. And it says Satan also came among them. Let me say something about the Satan figure. In Hebrew, it's not really a proper name. It's not, in your Bibles it's capitalized S, but really it should be a lowercase s with the word the in front of it. That's how it reads in Hebrew. In Hebrew, it's ha-satan, the accuser. Now, a lot of Old Testament scholars rightly say, look, this is somebody who's more, they say, look, it's not that this may not necessarily be the devil that we think of. This is more like God's prosecuting attorney or something to that effect. Every district in Oklahoma, right, has a district attorney that or a lead prosecutor who prosecutes cases. He's looking around, making sure if he sees anybody, any charges brought against anybody, he's going to take them to court. A lot of scholars are actually going to say that this is just one of God's prosecuting attorneys, one of God's divine council members, and all he's doing is just going about doing his job. It's not like he's doing anything wrong here. And it's not really, we can't read our Christian assumptions into this text to say this is the devil, because it doesn't really say that, right? Now, what I take of this view is I say, look, it is true that something like that would have been understood here. In the ancient world, they wouldn't have had a concept of the devil like we do today, not when Job was written. But I still think we need to see this person as the person we call the devil, the arch enemy of God, the original rebel of Genesis chapter 3. I think it's fine to do that. And the reason I say that is because even though the original readers probably wouldn't have understood it that way, there's enough evidence in this text to suggest that this being is adversarial. He's certainly trying to do something to God and trying to accuse God and Job of things that no good spiritual being would actually do in their right mind. So even though the original audience might not have had the same concept of devil here, the seeds are nonetheless present such that we can look back and say, okay, after having read all the Old Testament and the New Testament, which they didn't have back then, we can tell, yeah, this figure is definitely adversarial and he's completely nuts, okay? So I'm just throwing that out there. He perhaps was a divine council member who rebelled. I identify him as the devil. I just want to throw that out there because you'll read a lot of material, a lot of good material from people who are going to take a slightly different approach than this, but I don't think they actually go far enough in seeing this as the original rebel. I take him to be the original rebel. Okay, enough of that. The second thing I want to say about Job is that when I took Hebrew, my professor, she said, look, Job is sort of like a stage play. It's a story. And some scholars call it an epic poem. And it really does read like a stage play because you have one scene, the introduction, the scenes in heaven, Satan and God and all that talking. And then you have scenes after that where one person will talk and then he'll sit down and another person will stand up and talk and he'll sit down and another person will stand up and talk and you get the point. This operates like a stage play. So it's a story that I think is based on a real historical figure, but nonetheless is put into story form. And stories are powerful. Parables are powerful. Stories such as these can invite us to come in and live within them and begin to think through difficult topics that are easier to understand when they're depicted as a story. So anytime you get a story about God, we want to give the main character who is God the benefit of the doubt on every page. Like we shouldn't read the story through the eyes of Job per se, but we should read the story through the lens of the writer of the story, which was no doubt different than Job, okay? But nonetheless, just leave it at that for a moment. Okay, let's get back into the text. Enough of that aside. Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? And recall that we said that question was not a question asked by God to get information. Why? Why doesn't God need information? He's all knowing. He's got it all figured out, right? And I put some other passages on the text, Genesis 3, 9, 4, 6, and 10. This is where God asks the question to Adam, Adam, where are you? After he sinned. And he's like, okay, God, you know where he's at. But did Adam know where he was at, right? In chapter 4, you get the same thing with Cain, and he kills Abel. God's asking questions, where are you? Those sorts of things. What did you do, Cain? Like as if God didn't know what he did. When God asks questions in the Bible, it's always meant to get us to think about our situation and why we've messed up, right? And I think that's a plausible interpretation here. From where have you come? Not that God needs to know, but Satan needs to reckon with where he's been. Satan says, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down upon it. He's aimlessly wandering back and forth, language of exile, language of despondency. That's what's going on. Then we read how the Lord next said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? Again, this idea of consider, he's really asking Satan to consider your ways. Have you considered the way Job lives? Because you just told me, Satan, you're on the earth going to and fro, back and forth. There's someone else on the earth that I want you to consider. He's blameless and he's upright. He fears God and he turns away from evil. You, however, seem to be someone who is roaming about trying to find something bad to stir up. I want you to think, Satan, about your situation. I want you to think about yourself with respect to this wonderful person on Job. And immediately, Satan has to rebut that. He's going to launch an accusation. From here on out, it's new stuff tonight, okay, guys? So right here, this is in your notes if you want to follow along. The adversary, which is what Hasatan, who he is, Satan is, the adversary presents a twofold accusation. He's going to accuse two people of different things. Let's look at this. It says, then Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for no reason? Why would he ask that question? Well, because if God has presented Job as the righteous epitome of godliness, right? Then all Satan needs to do is question Job as the epitome of righteousness. He has to undercut the claim of God that Job is worth being compared to. Satan's, well, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hand and his possessions have increased in the land. So what he's done here is that Satan accuses Job. That's the next thing on your list. Satan accuses Job of what? Well, first, of being insincere, of engaging in false worship. Because he's not really worshiping God. He's worshiping God because God gives him stuff. He's accusing Job of having ulterior motives. He only worships God for God's stuff. So this is Satan's accusation against Job. He's undercutting the claim of God here, that Job is really all that. But Satan does something else. It's a twofold accusation. This is the first bit of accusation. What's the second one? Well, Satan accuses Job, but he also accuses God. He essentially accuses God here of misusing his power, his omnipotence, to essentially purchase Job's worship. He accuses God of manipulating Job to worship him. He's accusing God of not being a good God. So Satan has accused both parties of being unrighteous. God is only using God's power to get what God wants, because that's what God can do if God desires. Job, he's here for the ride, right? He gets all the cool stuff because of it. So then Satan gets an idea, and it is Satan's idea. And I want us to look at this satanic idea. He turns to God and he says, Satan says, but stretch out your hand. Everybody say with me, your hand. He's talking about God's hand. He says, God, stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. Now, you need to really tuck that red ink in the back of your mind. Stretch out your hand, because it's going to be very important in a moment. The Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So here's the question. Whose hand will strike Job? Well, that's the question. Whose hand? Yeah, Satan had the idea to say, God, you stretch out your hand and strike him. God declined the offer. He said, no. Everything is in your hand. Okay, fair enough. So what happens? Well, you get a first round of disasters. There's 2 rounds of disasters that Job experiences. This is the first round. Let's read the pieces here. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. Clearly these are not Baptist. These are a good Catholic family. Okay, drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them. And the Sabeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Now, he's describing moral evil. Moral evil are those evils that a moral agent performs. That's why it's called. Here the Sabeans came and murdered these people, these innocent people. That's moral evil. Natural evil is when, like, a volcano erupts. Nobody's causes the volcano to erupt, like no human does, right? And it just kills a lot of innocent people. That's natural evil. The difference between moral evil and natural evil is that when a moral evil is performed, you can throw someone in jail. When a natural evil is performed, there's nothing you can do about it, except lament, right? Okay. And then he goes on. More happens. He said, and while that messenger was still speaking, there came another one, and he said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Now remember that red font in just a moment, okay? He goes on, he says, while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he was yet speaking, my goodness, how many bad things can happen in a day? While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. A tornado or something like that happened, natural evil. But notice again verse 16. Remember that messenger who comes and says, a fire of God fell down from heaven. Question for you, is this an accurate statement of what happened? That the fire of God fell down from heaven? No. Because remember that part, Job 1, 11 through 12, where it says, Satan says, God, stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. And then that's when the Lord declined the offer. He says, no, everything that he has is in your hand, only don't kill him. So why did the messenger see fire, a meteorite or whatever it was, fall from heaven? Why did he see that and interpret that as an act of God? Well, I want to show some grace to the messenger because I don't think he's deliberately trying to lie, but nonetheless, nobody told him that this fire was of God or that it was from God. So how did he come to think it was from God? The answer is simple. The messenger simply interpreted the event, that disaster, as being the product of God's handiwork. He just interprets it like that. Has to be God, I guess. Came from up there, right? But see, here's the thing. You know the backstory. You've been into the unseen realm, as my friend Mike Heiser would put it, the unseen realm. You've peered into the throne room of God. You've got to peek into heaven. You've got to listen in on a conversation that this poor messenger was not privy to. The only reason we can look at this messenger and say, dude, you're whack. That's not actually what happened. Why did you say that? Oh, I forgot. You didn't get to go to the courtroom scene like I did. He didn't know. It's interesting that the messenger never mentions Satan's role in any of this. He lays it all on God. And again, why is that? Well, as I've just said, the messenger doesn't know about God and Satan's conversation. As far as I know, Job never learns about this conversation between God and Satan. So what is Job's response to the first round of disasters? Well, here it is. It says that, then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. So I want to take that phrase, the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away, and ask a question. Is that correct? Well, I'm going to say yes and no. I'm kind of like, depends what you mean, right? So let's just parse it out, pick it apart. Let's take that phrase, the Lord gave. Is that true? Yeah, I mean, God gave him all this stuff. The book starts off with saying how God has blessed him with all these camels and children, and I mean, he's a very prosperous guy. He's righteous. Like he's a good man, and God's blessed him. So I think the Lord did give all of him that stuff. But let's take that other phrase, the Lord has taken away. Is that actually true? Well, again, I'm going to be as charitable as I can here. I would say yes and no. I mean, let's talk about the yes. Yeah, the Lord has taken away. I mean, God did take away Job's stuff in the sense that he took away the hedge that protected Job. I mean, that's just what the text says. I'm just going with it. So it's true that the Lord has taken away in that sense, but it's not true in another sense. Because Satan all along is the active agent of destruction who is the one who takes away all of Job's valuables. Now, you might say, okay, Matt, you're like picking this apart a little too much. But I'm going to suggest, I think the text invites me to do this. Because there's that whole scene where it's emphatic. Lord, raise your hand and strike Job. And God says, no, I'm not raising my hand. All that he has is in your hand. And you have all this language that's meant to emphasize who's striking who, right? And when I read this, and I admire Job, and it's like, man, what a man of great faith, right? But even he doesn't quite get it right. Okay, at the very least, like I'm a person who's like, give me the truth and nothing but the truth, right? At the very least, just shoot straight, Job. At the very least, just the full truth should have been told. I mean, if you wanted to tell the full truth, Job, you should have included at least some mention of Satan's role. But insofar as it stands, Job never mentions Satan's role. And insofar as he fails to mention the role of Satan in all this, the whole truth about his suffering is being suppressed. It's just like the messenger who says, a fire from God fell down from heaven and killed everybody. Job is just simply interpreting the events around him when he says God gave and God took away. He's not, I mean, at the very least, Job, just say, yeah, God allowed it, but Satan did it. But he doesn't even mention Satan. And again, I'm going to just ask a dumb question, but why doesn't Job mention Satan playing any role whatsoever? Because you know he plays a role. And again, like I said, it's because Job is completely unaware that the conversation between God and Satan has ever happened. What's interesting, though, is if you read later in the book, Job does confess that he knows very little about his suffering, and if anything at all. He knows very little about what's actually happened. So let me give an assessment here just real quick. I think Job is correct that the Lord gives and God takes away. I think it's correct. God is, after all, involved in some way in his suffering. He permits it to happen for sure. But I think Job is incorrect in that he fails to mention Satan's role at all. And he puts everything on God. I'm not blaming Job for that because Job just doesn't have all the information. But the second thing I would say is Job is absolutely correct and right to never blame God. He never blames God. God doesn't do evil. God doesn't do anything crazy, right? But he wrongly thinks that God is the only agent involved. And despite any confusion that he has in his poor theology, and I'm going to talk about that in just a moment, in the midst of his suffering, he just refuses to forsake God. Job is like all in. He is committed. I applaud that with Job. We're going to get to the second attack. It happens again. So why a second time? Well, because Satan wants to prove that Job is unrighteous and only worships God for God's stuff. And clearly, so far, Satan's 0 for 1. It's not going to happen. Satan wants to prove, that twofold accusation. Okay. And again, we talked about this last time, but I have to say it again. Why doesn't God just step in and say, stop, Satan, too much. I'm coming in. I'm going to use my power to just kick you out of here, right? Why doesn't God do that? Well, like I said last week, if God used his omnipotent strength, his brute sovereign power, he'd prove Satan right. That God just uses his power to get what God wants when God wants it. Because that was part of the accusation. So if God did that, Satan would be proven correct in his accusation. That's the point. And I actually think this is what God says. We'll get to that next time we get to there. But nonetheless, he's trying to prove that point. So what God's actually going to do is not conquer evil through his power, per se. He's going to conquer Satan and evil by outsmarting Satan. We think of God's sovereignty, we think of his power, his ability to manipulate objects and people and things, right? Okay. But I think we should think of God's sovereignty as his omniscience. He's just so stinking smart that no matter what happens, God can figure out a way to get out of it, right? I think that's what's going to happen in Job, but I'm going too far. I need to stop, sorry. Okay, second rounds of attack. What happens? Well, again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking back and down upon it." It's just highly repetitive here, right? And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" This reminds me of a parent with their child. "Mom, I'm going to eat ice cream before I eat dinner." No, you're not. "Yes, I am." He throws a fit. "Go to your room." "Okay, I'm in my room." Comes back out. "Mom, I'm going to eat ice cream before dinner." "No, you're not." "Yes, I am." "Go to your room." It's just, you didn't get it the first time, not getting the second time. That's sort of what's going on here. Now God says to Satan, Job still holds fast his integrity, although, this is so important, although you incited me against him to destroy him without any reason. We're talking about how events are interpreted. This is God's interpretation of the first round of disasters, and it's so important. We will get to that next time we meet. Because how God sees this is super important. He feels incited. We'll talk about that later. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. All that a man has, he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand, touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand. Only spare his life." God once again declines the offer. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his feet to the crown of his head. And he took pieces of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women who speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this Job did not sin with his lips." Now then, this records when his three friends come and hear all the evil that had come upon him. They came and they wanted to show him comfort and so forth, just skipping that for the sake of time. And they saw him from a distance. The text says they did not even recognize him. They raised their voices and they wept, and they tore their clothes just like Job had done, and they sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him in his great suffering. They were good friends. Okay, sort of good friends. But at least here, they're just, sometimes we're at our best when we don't say anything, right? When we start yapping the yapper is when we get in trouble. At least I do. Here, they just show up and they just sit with him. And this is a good point. When people are going through suffering and they're experiencing great loss, please don't give them pat answers, right? Just sit with them, maybe cry with your tears will speak more sometimes. And sometimes the person who's grieving just needs to talk and cry and scream and shout and curse or whatever. And they need your ears more than they need your wisdom, right? At least that's the first. So applaud the friends, bravo. These friends are doing it right from the start. But I want you to notice what Job said to his wife earlier. He said to her, just recall this, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak." And Job says, "Shall we receive good from God and shall we receive evil?" This is a really interesting text to me. Let's evaluate. Job is correct in his devotion. That's no question there. But he may not be correct in his view about God. And it really all depends on what Job means by receive evil from God. The word evil can mean evil, right? Or it can mean calamity, like disaster, like bad times or something like that. It just really all depends. But I raise this again because we need to understand a very important truth. This is number 4 on your sheet. Job's theology and his views about his sufferings, they're just not always correct. Have you ever asked yourself that question when you've ventured into Job? Because, it's the Bible after all, and am I allowed to say that Job's views about God are not always correct? I think so. I'm not saying the Bible's incorrect. I'm saying one character in the Bible is saying things that's not always accurate. And that's nothing new. In the New Testament, you have Pharisees who are talking all kinds of weirdness, right? And they're wrong about God often. And just because I'm saying that some characters in the Bible don't get their theology right, please don't hear me to say that the Bible has bad theology. I don't believe that. But I think Job's theology is not up to par entirely. I'm not blaming him because, again, he lacks certain information. I want to kind of take us for a tour through the book of Job, and I want to show you, I want to prove this point. I want to prove to you that Job's theology about God is not always correct. And these verses come from an article that I read years ago by a well-respected scholar. And one of the things he says is, and he takes us through these verses, and he says, part of the point of the book of Job is to correct misunderstandings about God, to correct misunderstandings about theology. By the way, that theology, it just means words about God. You have a theology, I have a theology. It's whatever your view about God is, that's your theology. Sometimes people think that God, all God does is sit on a throne, got a bucket of lightning bolts underneath his arms, and he's ready to strike. He's angry. You know what I mean? Like, that's their theology of God, and that's a wrong theology. God is actually not quick to show wrath. He's quick to show mercy and kindness. He's slow to get angry. And some of us just haven't learned that because maybe we were brought up in a tradition that taught that God was just so angry all the time, right? Well, or just so wrathful, and he does bad things to me. Look, if that's you, I got great news for you. Like, Job's the book for you, man, because this book will help correct that. It's going to take us a few weeks to get there, but it's such a marvelous book in that respect. So, okay, well, let's take us through a tour. So in Job 9, here's what he says. He's talking about God. He says, when disaster brings sudden death, he, God, mocks at the calamity of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. God covers the faces of its judges. If it is not he, who then is it? He's accusing God of just laughing when innocent people suffer. Just laugh, like when a tsunami hits or war strikes out. God's up there. What's he doing? According to Job, he's just up there kind of just, eating popcorn, looking down and smiling and laughing about it. Do you think that's a good theology? Is that a good? No, Job's wrong. I like this last part. He says, if it's not he or God, if it's not God, then who is it? He really, at this point, doesn't have a full conception of the unseen realm, of the invisible world. Just God. I tend to think that's why that messenger who saw the fire from heaven come down, he just had no real concept of like a Satan figure, of an archenemy. Maybe it just had to be God, Because if it's not him, who else could it be, I mean, the ancient world, they believed in the gods, and there was always fights going on and so forth. But they probably didn't have a full-fledged sense of one diabolical evil leader called Satan, right? In that sense. And again, Job is not privy to these heavenly conversations. So if all you have is all this bad stuff happening, you'd probably say this stuff too. Okay, here's what else he says in Job 24. He says, from out of the city, the dying, they groan, and the soul of the wounded cries for help. Yet God charges no one with wrong. God doesn't care. Job 10, God, your hands fashioned and made me, and now you have destroyed me altogether. Man, eek. Verse 9 and verse 20 says, remember that you have made me like clay, and will you return me to the dust? Are not my days few? Then cease and leave me alone, that I may find a little cheer. Like, God, just go away so I can get some peace. This one, Job 30, verse 21. You have turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand, you persecute me. I'm like, dude, Job, no, it wasn't God's hand, man. But he doesn't know that again, okay? Surely now God has worn me out. He has made desolate all my company. And he has shriveled me up, which is a witness against me, and my leanness has risen up against me. It testifies to my face. He, God, has torn me in his wrath and hated me. He has gnashed his teeth at me. My adversary sharpens his eyes against me. It's so interesting that here Job calls God the adversary. He doesn't know the true adversary, the Satan. Have mercy on me, O you, my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. Why do you, friends, like God, pursue me? Why are you not satisfied with my flesh? Have I not given you enough to beat up on already? The hand of God has touched me. Again, Job 1, Satan says, stretch out your hand and touch all that he has. And God says, nope, not going to do it. And again, it happens in the second round where Satan says, stretch out your hand and touch me. And God says, nope, I'm not going to do it. So questions for Job. Dude, why are you blaming God when the true adversary, when the Satan is the one who's responsible for this? Why are you saying God touched you to harm you when that's what Satan did? And the text deliberately says God would not do that and did not do that. Again, Job has no clue about any of the conversation in the unseen realm. I want to give you some interesting facts, okay? After Job chapter 1 and Job chapter 2, which scholars call the introduction or the prologue, right? Just kind of the intro. After that, Satan is not explicitly mentioned again in the book of Job. I think he is mentioned, but not in the term Satan. We'll get to that later in a couple weeks, because I think Satan's in the other parts of the books too, or at least his henchmen are. Another interesting fact: after Job chapter 1 and 2, God often receives the blame for the actions of Satan. It's very interesting. We saw those verses. God's getting the blood end of the deal. Number 3, if we did not read chapters 1 and 2, where the conversations happen, God would look like he was to blame, right? Number 4, this is why chapters 1 and 2 are super important to the whole story of Job. And I think as readers, we need to, as we understand the suffering of Job, we have to bring in chapters 1 and 2, the invisible realm, the other agents of demise, the rebellious, sinister beings. Fifth interesting fact: Job actually later, he acknowledges that he didn't understand everything. He didn't understand his situation, and he needed to repent and have a change of mind. So this is clue that we're on the right track here, I think, because Satan's going to confess, I didn't understand what I was saying, right? Which is very interesting. So he repents, he changes, he admits he didn't get it all right. He does it in chapter 42, toward the end of the book. But before all that, he's accusing God and waving his fist at God. He's just asking questions and making accusations. So what happened? This is number 6. What happened in that space of time that would cause Job to realize that he was wrong and that he didn't have the full scoop? What happened? We're going. Here's the deal. Job experiences something in the pages as the story progresses. He experiences something very profound. And I think it helps him out to understand that, God didn't deserve the blunt end of my blame, and my theology did need to be corrected. But the question is, for us, what did he discover? That's the clue. That's the thing. That's the meat. Well, you'll have to come back later to figure that one out, okay? And I can't give you it right now. I know I'm known for these sorts of things. I apologize for being so evil. But I if I could just still say stuff, I would. But it's very important that we read, that we eat a lot, and then we go home and digest. We eat a lot, go home and digest. You know what I mean? You don't? Yeah. Amen. I'm with you. Totally with you. So that's number 6. There is one big question you're probably wondering about. I mean, in some sense, isn't God responsible on at least some level for Job's suffering? Doesn't God allow Satan to attack Job? And if so, how could God not be charged with causing evil? I mean, that's a very important question, right? And again, allow me to tease you. We're going to answer that question later. The next time we meet, we'll get more into that question, okay? But I want to end with this. Some takeaways, some just points of application. I think this is just the highlight of the night right here, what we're about to talk about. I hope it gives you peace. The first thing is, God does not wait for our theology to be perfect before he enters a relationship with us. Isn't that good news? Man. Of course, my theology is always right. It's not. I have a lot more to learn. You have a lot more to learn. We're never this side of heaven going to be able to figure everything out. But thankfully, God doesn't wait for our theology to be perfect. And if you're following along on your thing, that's point number 2. Point number 1 was God is big enough to handle our problems. You can probably think of another word for problems there, and it would work, right? God is big enough to handle, your mess, whatever. Number 2, God doesn't wait for our theology to be perfect before he's willing to be in a relationship with us. And number 3, God doesn't hate us when we are so confused and blame him for the things that he didn't do. And another way to put that is just say God is patient in our moments of not understanding, right? God is patient. The last thing, number 4, is another way to put that is just to say that, in other words, God is love. God is love. God is love. And I think we see that here. And even though it doesn't say in Job, God is love, right? It shows it in Job that God is love. It's really, really important. And, Job is blasting God through those pages that we showed you. And God just listens. It's really marvelous. There's a point, though, when God does speak, and he puts Job in his place. Okay, Job, where were you when I created everything, when the sons of God were singing praises to me? Surely Job. He really puts a lot on Job there, and he puts Job in his place. Look, here's the deal. If you want to be in a relationship with God, you're going to have to learn to pray in truth, and that might mean saying some things that are raw and everything. God can handle it. Remember, God can handle your mess. God doesn't wait for your theology to be perfect. God doesn't wait for your words to be perfect, okay? He loves you, cares for you. He'd rather have you come screaming and angry than you running from him, right? Yeah, okay, we're down with that. But just be prepared. If you come to God like that, he ain't going to let you leave without you getting something back, right? Because he wants a relationship. It's not fair for you to tell God exactly how you feel and him not be allowed to tell you. He's going to tell you. And his words are a gift. His words are a gift to you. And so take it. That's a relationship. Any relationship that's not founded on truth and transparency is not a relationship. Only relationships that are based on truth and transparency are true relationships. And that's what makes Job's conversation so important here, is because Job's theology is clearly not right. But at least he's coming to God with his questions, doubts, and fears, and anger, and hates. That's the true act of faith, is coming to God in all those. He could have ran from God and say, I'm done. And he doesn't. So it's coming to God with that. And again, nowhere does it say that God is love, but everywhere does it show God is love in the way he speaks, in the way he handles Job here. Now, I know that we're not getting yet an answer, why is there evil in the world? But we have to make sure that we get all these pieces in place. When we come back next time, we're going to go back to Job chapter 2, where we read this, where God tells us, Satan, you incited me against him to make Job suffer for no reason at all. We're going to pick that verse apart, because I think that's God's interpretation of the entire event. And I'm going to go with God's interpretation of the entire event. We're going to pick that apart piece by piece, and I think those are where the seeds are, where we can find answers to why there's evil in the world, because I think that captures the moment of how God begins to show us why Job is suffering and how God will cure Job's suffering. That gets us on the right track.